The 9,876 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is cooperation between the United Nations and regional and sub-regional organizations in maintaining international peace and security, European Union. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Kaja Kallas, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Kaja Kallas.
Madam President, Excellencies, it's an honor to address the United Nations Security Council. I would like to thank also Danish Presidency for scheduling this meeting, and I wish you the best for your presidency in this very critical time. This year marks the 80 years since the foundation of the United Nations, and it is facing unprecedented pressure. We see blatant violations of the UN Charter. We see attempts to replace the rule of law with the rule of force. The rules-based international order enshrined in the UN Charter is a set of universal principles that create conditions for peace, prosperity, human rights, dignity, and development for all. 80 years on, we see these principles under heavy fire. My message to you today is simple. Whether we are talking about support to international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights, the UN-led peace efforts, the security, to boosting multilateralism, to humanitarian efforts, or to funding, the EU will remain United Nations' reliable partner of choice. Let me take each of these 6 points in turn. First, the EU calls for the respect of international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights in every context they are at risk or actively violated, be it in Gaza, Sudan, DRC, Myanmar, Haiti, or Ukraine. Yet, for 3 long years, we have been witnessing an illegal war of aggression aimed at destroying a member state of the United Nations. Russia continues its unprovoked full-scale invasion. It continues to attack, destroy, kill civilians, spread false narratives, deny its war crimes, and evade responsibility. Let us not forget that 2 weeks ago in this chamber, Russia vetoed the Council's support to Ukraine's territorial integrity and to peace in line with the UN Charter. The UN Charter is sacrosanct for a safer world, be it in Ukraine or in any other country. That is why the European Union has supported Ukraine in line with its right to self-defense under the Charter, and why we also stand firmly with Ukraine for a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. It is the spirit of the resolution promoted by Ukraine and the EU, which was adopted by the General Assembly with large support of the UN membership. Europe has learned from its own history that giving in to aggressors' demands leads to more violence. Let's be clear. The war can end instantly if Russia, the only one responsible, withdraws its troops and stops bombing Ukraine. Russia can stop this war at any time, but it has chosen not to, despite all the efforts so far, because it has not achieved its war aims. This has not changed. Ukrainians do not want to be part of Russia. They have fought against this for 3 years. They deserve to choose their own future, and we should all stand by them. This war is neither a European war or a conflict between neighbors, nor a proxy war. Ukraine is a sovereign state of 40 million people that has fought for 3 years to survive and keep its independence. The consequences extend far beyond Ukraine, disrupting global food and energy markets. Also, because Russia has brought others, North Korea, Iran, to support this colonial battle too. North Korea's arms transfers to Russia, the presence of troops on the ground, as well as its nuclear program, weapons program, are serious violations of international law and resolutions of this Security Council. Iran's military support to Russia, including the delivery of ballistic missiles, is a major threat to international security. Therefore, we must all focus our efforts on achieving swiftly a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Secondly, the EU support to UN-led and international peace efforts. While these efforts are going on in all corners of the world, my first thought is of Gaza. The ceasefire in Gaza is holding but remains fragile. Thanks to the EU's border mission of Rafah, by 8th of March, over 3,500 people had crossed into Egypt, including over 2,000 people requiring medical treatment. Work is still ongoing. Too many civilians have been killed on both sides. It is critical that both sides uphold their commitments to international and humanitarian law and Phase 2 talks succeed. It is imperative that the delivery of humanitarian aid is not politicized or conditional. Any and all blockades to delivery of aid at scale must be lifted. The EU has been a #1 provider of humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people, both in Gaza and also in the West Bank. We intend to stay this course. The total humanitarian support of the EU and the member states in the 2 last years is almost 1.5 billion euros. Last year alone, we granted additional 120 million euros to this effort. While the EU Rafah border mission is our concrete contribution to supporting the ceasefire on the ground, the two-state solution remains the only avenue that will bring sustainable peace and security to the Middle East. For that reason, the EU supports diplomatic efforts through the Global Alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution. We stand ready to work with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and regional and international actors. Let me also say that the European Union firmly rejects any attempt at demographic or territorial changes in Gaza, in other parts of the world, anywhere, consistent with the UN Charter and international law. At the same time, the security of Israel is paramount to a lasting political solution. In this context, we welcome the Arab Recovery and Reconstruction Plan recently presented at the Cairo Summit and adopted also by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It is a serious plan for discussions on the future of Gaza, and we will be discussing these ideas together with our Arab partners. We support a future state of Palestine with Gaza as an integral part of it, and we will work with the international community in rebuilding Gaza. Our full support for the role of the UN and UN Special Envoy is also the case in Syria. The fall of Assad regime marked a historic moment and a chance for all Syrians to rebuild the country. But it is essential for all stakeholders to engage in Syrian-led and Syrian-owned dialogue. The atrocities we witnessed over the last days are unacceptable and show how fragile the situation is. They cannot happen again. Perpetrators must be brought to justice. In order for stability to take root, it is imperative for the transition to be peaceful and inclusive, and for civilians to be protected in all circumstances, in full respect for human rights and international law. We urge respect by all external actors of Syria's unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. In parallel, we welcome key developments in the right direction of an inclusive transition with the agreement announced yesterday between the Syrian Democratic Forces and Damascus, which could pave the way for more stability and a better future for many Syrians. On our part, and in order to help alleviate the dire socio-economic situation in Syria, the EU has suspended certain restrictive measures. We hope this will give much-needed breathing space, but we are ready to roll them back if we see any deterioration. The 9th Brussels conference next week on the 17th of March will address the transition's immediate needs, and I look forward to welcoming regional and international actors. This is a collective effort. The European Union is ready to up its support for an inclusive transition, to address the humanitarian needs and to help towards economic recovery. But we must continue to see the interim authorities taking the right steps and for all sides to refrain from violence immediately in order for Syria to set off on the right foot on the long road ahead. Beyond the Middle East, we should continue to work together to address the conflicts such as the one in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The recent Security Council resolution, adopted unanimously, sends a strong message to those responsible for the current escalation that territorial integrity in Africa or elsewhere is paramount. Excellencies, my third point is security. The EU-UN strategic partnership on peace and security is a long-standing strand of our cooperation. It demonstrates our shared commitment to global stability. Concretely, the European Union contributes to UN-led efforts through coordinated action by providing funds, by concentrating on prevention, as well as through our common security and defense policy. The EU provides predictable and sustained financing for peace building. For example, we are maintaining our annual €3 million contribution to the UN Peacebuilding Fund in the current cycle. And the EU member states account for over 1/5 of the UN peacekeeping budget. Prevention is at the core of peacebuilding efforts and therefore of security, and it is far more cost-effective than responding to crises. To reinforce these efforts, we are working to establish a group of friends of peacebuilding and conflict prevention. But beyond all that, the EU is a security provider in its own right. Since 2003, the European Union has launched more than 40 civilian and military missions and operations globally. 21 of them are ongoing and where we are often working hand in hand with the United Nations on the ground. To name just a few, there is Operation Aspides that has already protected over 340 ships transiting the Red Sea, Operation Atalanta to counter piracy in the Horn of Africa, Operation Althea in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is helping to preserve the stability of the country through its support for national authorities to maintain a safe and secure environment for all citizens, and Operation Irini to implement the arms embargo in Libya. Collectively, we can think about how peace-building and peace operations could better reflect the evolving peace and security landscape. This year's Peacebuilding Architecture Review and the Peacekeeping Ministerial will offer an opportunity. My fourth point this morning is that the EU remains steadfast in its commitment to multilateral solutions. The adoption of the Pact of the Future last year demonstrates that this commitment is widely shared in the world. Boosting multilateralism is obviously a matter of teamwork. This is also why we engage with partners at the regional level. Last year, we had the first ever EU Gulf Cooperation Council Summit. This year, with a ministerial and summit between the European Union and the African Union to mark the 25th anniversary of our partnership, and with the EU CELAC summit. There are many instances around the world of how multilateralism is the only way forward in solving issues. For example, Somalia. We will continue to support Somalia's unity and territorial integrity and our Somalian partners who are here in this chamber in your fight against terrorism. We welcome the new African Union support and stabilization mission and support to the UN proposed hybrid financing option for USOM as the first test case to implement the Resolution 2719. Myanmar is another instance of multilateral problem solving. The EU engages with ASEAN as well as opposition and pro-democratic forces with the aim of restoring Myanmar's democratic path and restoring peace and stability. But we also put our money where our mouth is. Together with the EU member states, in 2024, the EU was the second largest development donor in Myanmar. In Haiti, the EU supports a stabilization path leading to elections. We also support the multinational security support mission via financial contribution of up to 10 million euros. We are working with the United Nations on how to operationalize it. We support multilateralism not where and when it is in our interest, but because it is always in the collective interest. In this vein, the constant expansion of Iran's nuclear program fully contradicts Iran's own commitments as endorsed by the Security Council. At the same time, a multilateral approach like the JCPOA is key. There is no sustainable alternative to a diplomatic solution. My fifth point on humanitarian work. Humanitarian needs to continue to rise globally. Though others pull back, the European Union will always step up with almost 2 billion euro this year alone. In Sudan, for example, the war has caused the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The EU supports all meaningful efforts to put an end to the war and continues to work hand in hand with the international accountability mechanisms to bring the perpetrators of atrocities to justice. In 2024, the EU allocated close to 260 million euros to the humanitarian response to assist those in need in Sudan. The European Union has also promoted a non-aggression pact with the warring parties for critical infrastructure, such as dams and electricity grids. Regional and international pressure will be needed to help stop the destruction that is now unfolding. Another example is the EU's humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan, where the human rights situation continues to worsen, particularly for women and girls. We commend the UN efforts to initiate an UN-led political process, reinvigorating the Doha process. The EU stands ready to contribute where we can as a major donor, with the presence in Kabul. Excellencies, my sixth point is on financing. The EU and our member states demonstrate an unparalleled commitment to United Nations financial stability by paying on time and by paying in full. Collectively, we are the single largest official development assistance donor worldwide. 42% of global ODA in 2022 and 2023 were well over 90 billion euros. Much of this goes through the UN agencies. The EU and EU member states collectively make the single largest financial contribution to the UN system, year after year. EU member states jointly finance 1/4 of the UN regular budget. Together, the European Union and the EU member states provide 1/3 of all financial contributions to UN agencies, funds and programs. In 2022, our member states spent over 14 billion euro. The EU alone spends over 3 billion euro annually. This is more than anyone else. We are the cornerstone of United Nations financing. This is the most concrete example of our commitment and support to the UN. Madam President, Excellencies, I would lastly like to refer to three cross-cutting threats to global peace and security. First, terrorism, which affects us all. Let me assure you that our commitment to fight against terrorism is resolute, anticipating threats and jointly working with partners. Second, information manipulation and interference. It is increasingly used as a tool of hybrid warfare for covert operations by various actors. The online environment presents particular opportunities to manipulate free, open, and democratic discourse for political or economic gain. Recognizing this urgent challenge, the EU strongly supports the UN Global Principles for Information Integrity. Third, increasing attacks on gender equality. The Commission on the Status of Women is meeting this week. We also mark 30 years since the groundbreaking Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. We need to understand that gender equality is intrinsically linked to democratic resilience. The EU also fully supports the women, peace and security agenda. Excellencies, as I wrap up, let me emphasize the important imperative to reform our multilateral system. We all agree that we need to reinvigorate the UN to reflect the world of today. Reform of the Security Council is a necessary condition for this body to fulfill its responsibility of ensuring the maintenance of international peace and security. Concrete language on the Council reform in the Pact for the Future is an achievement that reflects the consensus among the United Nations members. The values and principles we adhered to 80 years ago remain the same. The purpose of the United Nations remains the same. The commitment of the European Union also remains the same. Our geopolitical context is changing, but you can count on the European Union as the United Nations' most reliable, credible, and predictable partner. Thank you.
And I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, today's discussion of the relationship between the UN and the European Union, the EU, and the EU's role in international efforts to maintain peace and security is occurring in a very special context. We can see that by the start of 2025, the EU's degradation from an economic project intended to prevent a new war in Europe by fostering cooperation between former opponents and enemies, its degradation into a political project, doing everything to sow enmity on our continent and to provoke such enmity and war, has come to an end. It's complete, in fact, this degradation. This sensible club aimed at integration, which used to promote cooperation with Russia, has today definitively turned into a fossilized, aggressive, Russophobic bloc, which has staked its energy, economic, social, and financial well-being on a pointless confrontation with its eastern neighbor. Today, more than ever, it's clear that the EU is precipitously losing in this confrontation. Today, we can clearly point out all of the key miscalculations of the EU's capital, Brussels, which resulted in this dire situation for the EU. In particular, I'd like to point out the enlargement of 2004, when, for political reasons, membership was extended to some states which hadn't fully aligned themselves with the criteria for membership which were established by the EU itself. As a consequence, the EU, the Poles, Baltic states, and a few other newly minted Europeans suffering from an acute sense of historical revanchism entered the EU with their Russophobic bats in the belfry. After 20 years, we can regrettably note that these bats have multiplied, taking up residence in the minds of those who not only suffered from Russophobia for decades, but had in fact previously advocated for mutually beneficial cooperation with Russia. This process was gradual, yet the negative changes have become more and more noticeable. In 2008, thus, the Eastern Partnership policy was formulated, aiming at cutting mutually beneficial ties between Russia and its neighbors and reorienting these ties towards the EU. The main victim of this was the Ukraine, where the West has consistently implemented its anti-Russia project, cultivating and promoting contempt for everything that's Russian, which is portrayed as being dangerous for the future of the aforementioned state, Ukraine. Unprofitable economic deals were imposed on the Ukrainian elite, requiring it to break up the common economic space it shared with Russia and requiring it also to eschew any kind of good neighborly relations with Russia as well. 6 years on, these efforts reached fever pitch. In 2014, there was an anti-constitutional coup d'etat in Kiev. The directors and producers of this coup d'etat were 3 EU countries, France, Germany, and Poland. They didn't keep the promises and guarantees they gave to the former Ukrainian president, Mr. Yanukovych. They didn't insist on the implementation of the agreements concluded with the EU's help by the new radical opposition. What happened next, we all know full well. The nationalists that acceded to power waged genuine war to destroy civilians, Russian speakers in the Donbass, thereby causing an intra-Ukrainian armed conflict. It could have been stopped thanks to the Minsk agreements, signed with the mediation of 2 EU members, Germany and France. However, as we know from the avowals of the former leaders of the aforementioned states, the regime in Kiev had no intention of implementing the Minsk Accords, whereas Berlin and Paris, instead of pressuring Kiev to do so, used the Minsk process exclusively as a smokescreen so as to arm Ukraine and to prepare it for war with Russia. And since the slaughter of the Russian-speaking population, which claimed the lives of over 10,000 people, not only did not end, but by February 2022 had significantly intensified, we were compelled to begin the special military operation. After that, the EU's Russophobia went through the roof. The EU refused cheap Russian energy based on the principle, cut off your nose to spite your face. Swallowing without protest the blowing up of Nord Stream, those pipelines, and pulling its own economy into a deep crisis, imposing sanctions on Russia, which it ended up harming itself in doing. The EU began banning Russian culture, calling Russian artists Ukrainian artists, making every effort to fund the war in Ukraine in the vain hope that the Zelensky regime will manage to inflict military defeat on Russia. When the new US president proclaimed a new course towards a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, the EU became an apologist for war, definitively completing its degradation. It's now doing everything it can to thwart the US-Russian dialogue on Ukraine. We need to look no further than the recent pronouncements by the Danish PM, Ms. Mette Frederiksen, and here I quote, "Peace in Ukraine is more dangerous than ongoing war." No need to comment on that. Madam President, some countries are today upset that we're not engaging in dialogue with Europe. Russia hasn't engaged in dialogue with the EU not because we suspended such dialogue, but simply because the EU itself did this. There are no longer any interlocutors of sound mind left for us to speak to. Today's meeting illustrates this well, because the briefer was the new High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, a genuine Russophobe, Ms. Kaja Kallas. She's well known in Russia. We recall what she said back when she was the Prime Minister of Estonia. And here I quote, "Russia's defeat is not such a bad thing. And it's not such a bad thing if a big power is made smaller." End of quote. In her new role, Ms. Kallas, fantasizing about the strongest army in Europe, which is how Ms. Kallas describes the Ukrainian army, fantasizing about its entry into NATO, she had the temerity to assert that Russian citizens are not dying in the conflict, demonstrating at the same time the flag of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Marine Brigade, responsible for countless crimes and killings in the Kursk region, and these against civilians. How can Russians respond to such outrageous assertions if in the last year alone the number of casualties, civilian casualties on Russian territory amounted to 5,500, of which 809 people were killed? 347 children were amongst the casualties and 51 children died. At the start of this year, after Ruskoye Porechnoye, a settlement in the Kursk region was liberated, in the cellars of residential buildings, we found Ukrainian armed forces torture chambers. The bodies of 7 locals were found there. They were mainly elderly persons. They had been tortured to death by the Ukrainian Nazis. This is not a staged scene like Bucha, where the Kiev princeling takes Western guests on guided tours. These are actual crimes. We've drawn the attention of the Security Council on countless occasions and done the same in other international fora. Just a few days ago, in that same village, more bodies were found. They died in a similar fashion, and probably in the next few days, this lamentable list will only get longer because Ukrainian armed forces are now suffering massive losses, fleeing frantically from the Kursk region. We've now liberated territory that stretches across tens of square kilometers. Just today, the largest attack by Ukrainian drones on Russian territory was waged, and this includes Moscow and the region around it. 337 drones have been struck down. 91 were above Moscow. People died and there were casualties. This is surprising, given that the Secretary General of the OSCE was visiting Moscow on that same day. The Kiev regime seems to want to demonstrate to the Secretary General its true terrorist colors. Ukrainian drones were directed at civilian sites. We've underscored this on many occasions. The Russian armed forces are striking on military infrastructure and infrastructure tied to the Ukrainian military-industrial complex. We do not target residential areas or social infrastructure, in contrast to the deliberate Ukrainian attacks on civilian sites in Russia. Colleagues, how do you see our discussions with such characters who have been bitterly hating Russia for years now? Even before her high European appointment, Ms. Kallas directly participated in a years-long campaign in Estonia aimed at squeezing out the Russian language from Estonia, which remains the mother tongue for a noteworthy section of the Estonian population. As a result, roughly 5% of Estonians are stateless, although they're going to do away with this status in the near future. Almost all educational opportunities in Russian have been eliminated. An active fight is being waged on dissent by the Estonian Orthodox Church and on the Estonian Orthodox Church. Nazis are strolling the streets and monuments to Hitler's accomplices are being erected. In a word, when she goes to Ukraine or speaks to the Zelensky regime, Ms. Kallas seems to be in an ideologically friendly environment. She's bothered by the rights of the Russian-speaking population, tens of thousands of political prisoners, a lack of political freedoms, draconian censorship, and prosecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. She's not bothered because she's seen this all of this before at home in Estonia. And that's why she truly believes that the violations of the rights of Russians, the killing of Russians, is normal. Can you fathom even a hypothetical dialogue between Russia and the EU when the EU is represented by politicians with these convictions? The EU, which can bar a frontrunner from running in presidential elections without putting forward any convincing accusations. This is what happened in Romania. Colleagues, by way of conclusion, in light of the above, I'd like to call on you to think long and hard about whether the UN needs to engage in dialogue with such a body, which itself flagrantly violates human rights, but is strongly associated the world over with the aggressive imposition of neoliberal approaches and with the pontificating on human rights, combining this with neocolonial approaches, cultivating pocket dictatorships, and imposing harsh sanctions on anyone who disagrees with it. This approach does not and cannot bear any relation with the UN's efforts and with the principles governing the UN's cooperation with regional organizations, as per Chapter 8 of the Charter. It comes as no surprise that countries of the Global South, instead of aligning themselves with the European so-called rules, are increasingly opting for non-coercive groupings on an equal footing, for instance, BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. As for the Russian Federation, we stand ready to partake in a mutually respectful dialogue with those European countries which aren't guided by the paradigms of the Kallases and von der Leyens of this world. That is, those who are pursuing above all their national priorities and the needs to establish on the European continent sustainable and long-term peace based on the respect of the positions and interests of all states, including Russia. The more we have, the more states we have in Europe who don't share the Russophobic convictions of Ms. Kallas and her ilk, the better the chances of peaceful, progressive development on our common continent. I thank you.
The statement and comments made by the representative of the Russian Federation. I'd like to remind all members that this is a place of respect and decorum. We're here to discuss the cooperation between the United Nations and European Union. Council members are therefore reminded to refrain from comments of a personal or disrespectful nature.